Today I want to take a couple of minutes and talk about the difference between an IEP and a service plan. Now, it's important to remember that under IDEA, students are not required to get any type of special education services if the parent decides to enroll the child in a private school. Now, there are variations of that. Now, to deal with that, many private schools, including Catholic schools, deal with the concept of accommodations. They say that they will make accommodations for students' needs. That means that a child might be given extended time on a test. The student might be given time outside to work with a reading specialist. But when those accommodations are made, that's really up to the school to do, and the local jurisdiction has nothing to do with it. Now, what's important is that, as we've talked about over the last couple of weeks, IDEA requires that every student receive a free, appropriate public education. Now, some parents decide that that is not what they want, and they will send their children to private schools. And as a result, some parents think that they are automatically allowed to get the same services that they would receive in a public school. The answer to that is no, they're not. Now, let's look at some basic definitions. What is an IEP? An IEP is a blueprint. It is a blueprint for the services that a child will receive in a public school if they have been identified as having a disability. Now, a service plan is a little bit different. A service plan is paid for by the local education agency, what's often referred to as the LEA. Now, a child can receive those services. Now, the thing to remember here is that a service plan does not say that a child will receive a free education. It says that some services might be available to the child. But again, there is a process that the parents and the child must go through in order to qualify for that. Now, an IEP spells out very specifically the services, the supports, and the specialized instructions that a student will receive in a public school. That's provided at no cost to the parents. Now, a service plan is a plan that spells out the special education and related services that the LEA will make available to the child. Now, these services are provided at no cost to parents, but the student might not be able to receive those services at the private school. It depends on the state and local legislations. Now, in some jurisdictions, private schools are allowed to bring in approved and contracted individuals to work with students. That could be speech therapists, that could be occupational therapists. But it depends on the local jurisdiction. It depends on the state regulations. Some states have very strict laws saying that a child may not receive any kind of services at the school. In that case, the child must go off campus. Now, I've seen this done in many ways. In one jurisdiction, I found it rather interesting that there were a number of students that needed particular services. The local LEA decided that they would rent space in a strip mall that was a block or two away from the school and set up shop in a storefront. And the students, they would have to go to that storefront. Parents were required to bring the child to that location to receive the services. Now, that works sometimes. In many cases, you don't have available space, and the local jurisdiction is not willing to pay for the rental of those facilities as well as the staffing. Now, there are a couple of other things that are really important when you look at IDEA. We basically talk about the funding. IDEA says that public school students with disabilities must receive individualized services to provide free, appropriate public education. It is not budget dependent. That means that schools should not limit services because of money. Now, in a service plan, students do not have an individual right to get the same special education and related services as they would in a public school. Instead, they're entitled to equitable services. This is based on the funding available for the private schools. Now, in many jurisdictions, this takes place at the diocesan level in Catholic schools, or in certain independent school associations. They cluster together, group together, and act as one unit. Now, for instance, in the Archdiocese of Baltimore, they basically tried to funnel all the funds through the diocese. The diocese coordinated the entire program and worked with the local LEAs. Now, that's nice, but not all diocesan or archdiocesan systems allow that or have the staff to deal with it. So it's important to find out how funds are distributed in your local jurisdiction. Now, who's eligible? To qualify for an IEP, a child must, one, they must be identified as having one of the 13 disabilities covered under IDEA. They also must need special education for this disability in order to successfully benefit from and access a general education curriculum. That's an important concept to remember. Now, who qualifies for a service plan? Well, a child must do the following. They must be placed in a private school by their parents, not as an out-of-district placement. Because in some jurisdictions, they will send a child to a special education school that is a private school, and it is 100% funded by the local jurisdiction. That doesn't happen in too many cases anymore. But again, for the service plan, a child must be placed in the private school by the parents. They must be identified as having one of the 13 disabilities covered under IDEA. And they must need special education in order to successfully benefit from and access a general education curriculum. So again, slight differences, but important differences. Now, when we look at who creates the program, for an IEP must be created by a team that includes the following: a parent or legal guardian, a general education teacher, a special education teacher, a professional who can interpret evaluation results, and a school administrator who knows about general and special education and who oversees special education services at the school. So that's the IEP. Now, for a service plan must be created by the same people who make up an IEP, as well as representatives from the private school. So again, many of the same people are there, with the addition of the administrator from the private school. Now, parental consent. For an IEP, a parent must provide written consent for the school to evaluate the child. The school can't just say, well, I think this child has a disability, we're going to have them tested. No, The school must have written consent from the parents or legal guardian. They also have to provide written consent before the school can provide the services. So once the student has been evaluated, a plan comes up. Before the plan can be implemented, the parents must sign off on it. Now, for a service plan, a parent must provide written consent for their child to be evaluated. And this is important, the LEA will conduct the evaluation. So it's not done by the school or someone that they recommend. It's done by the LEA, by the local jurisdiction. The parent must request that the LEA in which the private school is located evaluate the child instead of the LEA in his local district. But the LEA will make the final decision. So a parent can request that someone else do it, but it's up to the LEA to decide whether that's actually going to happen or not. Now, what are the rights that a child has? IDEA requires public schools to provide services to students with the least restrictive environment. The least restrictive environment. Parents have a say in the educational decisions for their child. Under IDEA, there are specific rights and protections for parents as well as for children with learning and attention issues. And those are called procedural safeguards. Again, you've heard about that when we talk about the essential 6 basic principles. Now, for a service plan, parents have a say in the educational decisions for their children. But the LEA must evaluate students in a private school who may need special education services. This is known as child find. If a parent thinks the LEA has failed to identify or evaluate their child, they can follow the due process procedures. So there's a whole list of things that a parent can do if they feel that they are not getting the services from the LEA. Parents do not have due process rights if they have concerns regarding a school and saying the school isn't providing a free and appropriate public education. Why is that important? Because if a child has a service plan, they are not required and are not allowed to have a free, appropriate public education. Why? It's because they're in a private school. Now, what about the IEPs and how often are they evaluated? An IEP must be reviewed at least once a year. So once a year, the IEP must be reviewed by all the parties involved. Everybody has to agree to it, and everybody must sign off on it. The student must also be reevaluated every 3 years to see if the services are still needed. So just because a child has a disability in year 1, IDEA says, well, maybe something's happened and they no longer need those services. Maybe they need additional services. But again, complete evaluation of the disability must take place every 3 years. For a service plan, IDEA says a service plan must be reviewed to the extent appropriate as often as an IEP. It doesn't say that it's required. It says as appropriate. So you have more wiggle room there. In a service plan, it doesn't specify how often a service plan must be updated. So those are the differences between IEPs and the service plans. It's really important that you as an administrator understand the differences between those. Students who are placed in private schools by their parents give up their right to a free, appropriate public education. However, they can still receive services. They can still have those services paid for by the local jurisdiction. There is a process, and it's outlined in the materials from the Department of Education, Special Education Division. Anytime you're confused or concerned about whether you are following that, it's really easy to go to the Department of Education, United States Department of Education, and review those materials. And they are always willing to give you some advice. Also, I encourage all administrators to contact their local LEA to engage with them about funding possibilities, about child find, about evaluation processes, so you as an administrator understand what is available to the students who are in your school, in your private school. So again, as an administrator, whether you're in a public school or a private school, it's important to understand the law. It's also important to understand that accommodations are not the same as writing an IEP or a service plan. I appreciate you listening today, and if you have any thoughts, comments, or questions, please feel free to let me know. I appreciate it and have a great day. Thanks.